Chapter 1. There is a kind of fear that has nothing to do with danger. It is the fear of losing the thing that makes you who you are, not the fear of death. Something quieter and harder to name. The fear of waking up and finding that the version of yourself you have spent your entire life building, through thousands of hours of practice, through physical pain accepted willingly, through every morning that started before anyone else was awake, might be gone. Not taken suddenly, just gone. The way a hand placed on a fire doesn't burn until the burn is already done. In 1970, Bruce Lee, who had trained his hands to grip like iron, who had trained his speed past what cameras could follow, who had built his body into an instrument that other martial artists traveled from across the world to study, lay flat on his back and was told he might never kick again. This is the story of what he did with that. Chapter 2. The Morning. It happened. It was an ordinary training morning in 1970. Lee was performing an exercise called the Good Morning, a strength movement where a barbell is placed across the shoulders and the body bends forward at the hips, loading the lower back and the posterior chain under weight. He was performing it without a warm-up. The weight was too heavy for the state his body was in that morning, and his fourth sacral nerve, a nerve running through the lower spine, one of the roots of the sciatic nerve, was damaged. The pain was immediate and severe. He was taken off the training floor. The doctors who examined him delivered two pieces of information. The first was that the injury was serious, a sacral nerve injury that would require complete rest and an extended recovery period. The second was a word that Lee had spent his entire life training to make irrelevant. They told him he might never kick again at a high level. For a man whose side kick could break a heavy bag chain, a man who had built his entire martial identity around the physical capability of his body, that sentence carried a weight that no barbell ever had. He went home, he lay down, and he stayed there for 6 months. Chapter 3. The Silence. 6 months of stillness is a particular kind of suffering for a man built on motion. Lee could not train, could not spar, could not run, could barely move without pain in the early weeks. He had two choices about what to do with the hours. The first choice was to wait, to mark time until his body healed, and he could return to being what he had been before the bar came down on a spine that wasn't ready for it. The second choice was to use the stillness as material. He chose the second. He read. He had always read. Boxing manuals, philosophy texts, fencing theory, psychology, anatomy. But now he read differently. Now he had no practice to return to in the afternoon. The reading was not supplementary. It was the whole day. He wrote notes that had been accumulating in fragments, ideas about Jeet Kune, about philosophy, about the nature of combat and the nature of the self, began to find their order. In the quiet of a room he could not leave, the scattered pieces of a system started to become a whole. He organized his notes into what would eventually become the Tao of Jeet Kune, the fullest written expression of everything he had spent 15 years developing. The most comprehensive work of his life was written flat on his back, unable to demonstrate a single technique, unable to throw a single punch. He had become water again, completely filling the container he had been placed in, not fighting its shape. Chapter 4. What Fear Looked Like. From the inside, people who knew Lee during this period described two versions of him. There was the version he showed in conversation, still engaged, still thinking, still teaching anyone who came to him, still relentlessly curious. The version that turned his recovery room into a classroom and kept his mind at full speed even when his body was at a complete stop. And there was the other version, the one that appeared in the hours between conversations, the version that lay quietly and faced what he had not let himself face during the years of continuous motion. Bruce Lee was afraid, not of pain. He had trained through pain his entire adult life, not of failure. He had encountered failure and moved through it enough times to understand its texture. He was afraid of permanence. The injury might not heal fully. The kicks might not come back at the level they had been. The body he had built with such exactness and such obsession might never fully return to what it was. That fear, the possibility that the loss was not temporary, was the hardest thing he had trained for least. And sitting with it, unable to outrun it through training, unable to answer it through physical performance, he had to meet it directly. He wrote about this. He wrote that the obstacle was not the injury. The obstacle was the attachment, the identification of himself with what his body could do. Water, he had written, has no fixed form. It becomes what it must become. A man who had built his identity entirely on physical capability was being asked, by an injury and a doctor's sentence, to find out whether that was true of him too. Chapter 5. The Return. The nerve healed. Not completely and not quickly. Sacral nerve damage leaves residual effects that Lee would manage for the rest of his life. He was never fully free of the lower back issue. Pain remained a part of his daily reality from 1970 onward, but the kicks came back, not because he ignored the doctors, because he followed the recovery with the same deliberate, systematic obsession he had brought to every other aspect of his training. He understood the injury mechanically. He had spent months reading anatomy during his recovery, and he rebuilt around it rather than fighting through it blindly. He modified his training. He strengthened the muscles that supported the compromised area. He changed the way he distributed load in certain movements. He adapted the way water adapts, not by pretending the obstacle isn't there, but by finding the path that the obstacle allows. 2 years after the injury, he was filming Enter the Dragon. 2 years after being told he might never kick again at a high level. 2 years after lying flat on a bed for 6 months, writing a book in the hours between fear and sleep. He was on a film set in Hong Kong, moving so fast the camera couldn't keep up. Chapter 6. What the Injury Built. The Tao of Jeet Kune Do would be published after Lee's death. It remains the most comprehensive written work on the philosophy of martial arts ever produced by a practitioner. It would not exist without the injury, not because Lee couldn't have written it otherwise, but because the 6 months of stillness, the fear, the confrontation with the possibility of permanent loss, the hours with nothing but thought and a notebook, all of that is in the book, not stated directly, but present in the depth of it. The way water is present in stone that has been shaped by a river over centuries. The injury stripped away the activity. What remained was the thinking that the activity had always been built on, the philosophy that had been driving the training all along, never fully articulated because there had always been another session to get to. Forced to stop, Lee found out what he actually knew. It turned out to be more than anyone, perhaps including him, had realized. Chapter 7. The Real Lesson. The lesson of 1970 is not about injury. It is about what you discover when the thing you have built your entire identity around is taken away from you, even temporarily, even partially, even as a possibility, and you have to find out whether there is anything underneath it. Lee found out there was. Not only was there something underneath, there was something that had been waiting, quietly, for the motion to stop long enough to be heard. Whatever your equivalent of that silence is, the project that failed, the relationship that ended, the career that closed, the body that stopped cooperating, there is something waiting in it that the constant motion of ordinary life will not allow you to find. The obstacle is never only an obstacle, it is also a room with a window, and enough quiet for the work that motion keeps interrupting. Subscribe to the Bushido Code. One more video in this series, the philosophy that ties everything together, 10 rules, 1 man, everything you need.